I must say that being collected at the airport by Lonnie is a little bit like being greeted by the Empress of Winnetka. So I felt suitably honored, and it's wonderful to be here for Fan, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here, so thank you for that. Before I do my talk, I'm going to show you a trailer that I made. Just before the book was published, I re-interviewed a few of its subjects on film, and I did so really in hopes that the audiences who saw it would realize that I haven't made up the stories of eloquence that I described, that actually people who have had the extraordinary experiences I was documenting are often able to speak of them in extraordinary ways. So I got several of the people who have remained close friends to come for a day of filming, and we made a film, which I will show you now. Andrew?
When I was born deaf, my mother cried. She really did not see a future.
The doctors said he would never amount to anything, his mental capacity would be little to none, and you should probably give him up and think about adoption.
I really didn't even know that something was going on, that there was something wrong in my mind.
I didn't know the word transsexual, the word transgender hadn't even been invented yet.
He has a mentor that helps him. No biting, Chris. Chris probably had one of the worst diagnoses ever. Self-injurious, swollen intestines, poisons in his system, mental retardation, severe autism. And I was pretty much told to put him in an institution.
When I was born, my mom refused to see me for 3 days. She was scared.
Before I transitioned, I just wasn't all there. I couldn't quite share my feelings. I couldn't quite be a full member of the family.
You sort of get what you get, and you go from there. And you know, it's your choice. You want to make the best of it, you make the best of it. You want to make the worst of it, throw yourself a pity party.
I set out to write a book which was about how people found meaning in difficulty. It's hard for the kids to accept themselves. It's hard for their families to accept them. It's hard for the larger society to accept the kids and their parents. All of it is a struggle. I wouldn't ever want to pretend that these aren't difficult lives. They are very difficult lives. They're full of pain and complexity.
We have joints and bones that are twisted and distorted. So our life is marred with a lot of surgeries. Myself, I've had 30.
And there was one guy that I had a crush on. He said to me, "Why do you lisp?" And my heart was crushed.
Chris did not communicate, he didn't sit down, he didn't put on clothes, he wouldn't go outside. He ate the walls, he ate the table, he ate the rug.
I could feel the back of my neck, popping and sizzling, like my head was just heating up.
We couldn't eat in the home, we couldn't have lights on, we couldn't have the TV on. If I coughed, he would run downstairs and punch me.
I actually felt that I was a surgeon, and I felt I had to literally extricate the demon from inside of my body.
When I started this book, I knew that I was going to be looking at a lot of desperate situations.
And I would do that by cutting and burning myself.
What I didn't know was how much joy I was going to find.
When I was born, my dad said, "He looks cute. He's just got a big head and little arms." The funny thing is, I still look that way.
And the relief that came over my face when I heard that there was a name to what was going on with me.
I used what God gave me. God didn't give me, legs to run. He didn't give me arms to play football with. He gave me a brain, and he gave me a heart, and I try to use both of those things to the fullest.
The thing I've learned most over the years is to be a parent first. I thought to myself, if he's happy, if he stops hurting himself, if I could hug him, that would be the greatest gift in life.
It's kind of pretty sure that I'm going to have obstacles, but I would have had them anyway.
I know my dad was very, very proud of me because I went on a journey that he never dreamed possible.
I don't think of myself as a schizophrenic. I am Susan.
There really isn't any definition of what's normal or not normal, or far from the tree or right under the tree.
I'm lucky to have had her in this particular period of time. Thank you.
The love that parents have for their children.
I guess we are pretty lucky, huh?
Yes, Mom.
Yeah.
Can see them through an enormous amount.
Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That's Time magazine in 1966, when I was 3 years old. And in the last year, as all of you doubtless know, the President of the United States and the Supreme Court have expressed support for gay marriage. And I set out to write my book determined to figure out how that had happened. How had something that was unconditionally a crime and an illness in the public eye turned into an identity? And if something could shift so readily from being an illness to being an identity, what else could make that shift? Those were the questions with which I started off. When I was perhaps 6 years old, I went with my mother and my brother to a shoe store in New York. It was called Indian Walk Shoes, which I think wouldn't go down so well today, but it was all right at the time. And at the end of getting our shoes fitted, we were asked by the salesman whether we'd like a balloon to take home, and of course we would. So my brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother said that she thought I'd really rather have a blue balloon. And I said, no, I really wanted the pink one, and she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. The fact that my favorite color now is blue, but I'm still gay, gives you some evidence of my mother's influence and its limits. When I was growing up, my mother used to say all the time, the love you have for your children is like no other feeling in the world, and until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. And when I was little, I took that as the greatest compliment. It meant that life with my brother and me had been her chief joy. And as I got older, I thought, but I'm gay and I might not have children, and when she said it, it made me anxious. And then I came out in my early 20s, and she went on saying it, and it made me really angry. I said, you know that's not the path that I'm on. You know that's not what I'm doing. I want you to stop saying that. But she never did. 20 years ago, my editors at the New York Times Magazine assigned me an article about deaf culture. And I was very taken aback, because I had thought of deafness as entirely a disability, those poor people who couldn't hear. It hadn't occurred to me that deafness was an identity. And I was also bewildered because I had mostly been doing foreign reporting up until then. And my editor said, this is a foreign culture within our own, and we thought you might be able to get inside it. And so I went off and began to meet deaf people. The first deaf person I met was Jackie Roth, whom you just saw in the film, who became a great friend. As I got deeper into that world of the deaf, as I discovered deaf clubs and went to deaf parties and saw deaf theater and went to meetings at which everybody was communicating in sign language, I began to have an emergent sense of this culture. I even went to the Miss Deaf America contest in Nashville, Tennessee, where my translator complained about that slurry Southern signing. And as I threw myself deeper and deeper into the deaf world, I became convinced that deafness was a culture. It wasn't my culture, and I didn't particularly want to be a deaf person in general, but there were moments when I was at deaf parties when I would think, gee, I wish I were deaf. I wish I could follow all these conversations that are springing up all over the room. I wish I were part of this. I really came to understand the identity model, and then I realized that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, that those hearing parents tend frequently to attempt to get them to assimilate into the hearing world, at that time through lip reading and the development of oral speech, and that many of those deaf people discover a sense of identity only in adolescence or thereafter, when they finally discover other people who are like them. And I thought it was so similar to the experience of gay people who are born to straight parents, who often communicate the message that it would be best if you could function in the straight world, and who ultimately, these gay people, find identity when they find community in adolescence or thereafter. And I wrote about that parallel. And then a few years later, a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf. And it turns out most dwarfs are born to children of average height. And Lisa began asking all these questions. Should I bring my daughter up to think she's just like everyone else, only short? Or should I try to build some kind of dwarf identity? Do I have to become a member of the little people of America? How am I going to construct this child for herself? And as she narrated her bewilderment, I thought, here it is again. Here it is once more, a family that perceives itself to be normal, with a child who is in some striking way exceptional and different, and a set of complex identity questions that come along with it. And so from that, I thought there must be other categories that were similar, and indeed, in my book, I examined 10 different such categories: deafness, dwarfism, Down syndrome, autism, schizophrenia, multiple severe disabilities, prodigies, who are also quite overwhelming to their parents, women bringing up children conceived in rape, families of people who commit crimes, and families of people who are transgender. And as I got deeper and deeper into all of those worlds, I gradually hatched a vocabulary for what I was experiencing and said that there are essentially two kinds of identity. There are vertical identities that are passed down generationally from parent to child. So one's ethnicity, one's nationality, usually one's language, often one's religion. These are things people have in common with their parents. And so while you could make arguments, convincing arguments, that it's harder in the United States as it's currently constructed, the current presidency notwithstanding, to be a person of color, or harder to be a Jew or a Muslim than to be a Christian, there are all kinds of identities that could be harder, but nobody is trying to cure them. Nobody is doing research to make sure the next generation of children born to Asian, Latino, and African American parents come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. And then there are what I call the horizontal identities. Horizontal because they're identities that are learned from a peer group. They're identities that involve your engaging with other people who are like you, and they're things that you don't have in common with your parents. So all those areas that I listed as my 10 chapters, and many others beside, are horizontal identities. As I looked at this question of identity formation and looked at how families responded to children who are different, I was struck by a distinction which had previously eluded me, which was between love and acceptance. My parents didn't immediately accept me for who I was, and at the time I experienced that as a deficit of love. When I began working on this, I thought, love is something that most parents, not all surely, but most parents feel for their children from pretty much the moment they're born. And acceptance is a process that takes a long time and is full of difficulty, even in families where things don't seem so unexceptional. So while I think acceptance should always be the goal of love, it's not the same thing. And I realized as I worked on this book that my parents, in fact, had always loved me, and there was only acceptance that stood behind. And as I thought about acceptance, I thought that acceptance really has to occur at multiple levels. People have to have self-acceptance, people with some kind of stigmatized difference. People have to have family acceptance, and then hopefully there's social acceptance. And each of these things feeds the others. So in a society which is more accepting, it's easier for someone to arrive at self-acceptance. But someone with really good self-acceptance can go out and change his family and the society around him. And the interaction of those three modes was very interesting to me. And the interaction of responses that parents had. Some of the parents faced with children who were different were outraged. Many were bewildered. Some were actually celebratory. I'm going to tell you some of the stories from the book, and I'm going to begin with Clinton Brown, who's the dwarf you just saw in the video. He has a condition called dystrophic dwarfism. As he explained, it results in very extreme deformities, and when he was born, his parents were in fact told that he wouldn't live very long and they should leave him in the hospital to die. That his mother said she wasn't going to do that. She was going to take her baby home. And even though she didn't have vast educational or economic resources, she found her way to the best doctor for dwarfism in the United States at that time, Dr. Stanley Kopetz at Johns Hopkins. And she brought Clinton in, and in the course of his childhood, as he mentioned, he had these 30 major surgical procedures which were designed to make it possible for him to walk. And indeed, as a result of them, he now can walk for limited distances, but he can walk. While he was in the hospital having all those procedures, there wasn't anything else very much to do, so he thought he might as well focus on his schoolwork. And so that's what he did. And he worked very hard on his schooling, and he achieved at a level that no one else in his family had ever even imagined. And he went off to college, one of the first people in his family to do so. And his mother called me on the telephone one day, And she had mentioned to me he went to college not far from where they lived, and he drove a specially fitted car. It was very easy to spot because it had all of these adjustments to it. She said, I was driving home from shopping today, and I went past a bar, and there was Clinton's car parked outside a bar. She said, I wanted to go in there and tell him to get the heck out, but I knew I couldn't do that. So I went home, and I left him 11 messages on his answering machine. She said, and then I thought, if someone had told me when he was born that my future worry would be that he would go drinking and driving with his college buddies, I'd have been so thrilled to have that problem. And I said to her, what do you think it is that's allowed Clinton to become the person he is? Someone who's so charming, someone who's so appealing, someone who's so intelligent and accomplished and popular. I said, what did you do? And she said, what did we do? We loved him, that's all. Clinton just always had that light in him, and we were lucky enough to be the first to see it there. I'll tell you about one other dwarf who I got to know, not to overdwell on that chapter, but just because I think this story is so telling. This is a young woman named Kiki Peck. She lives in Michigan, and she has something called Kinesin Dysplasia, which is a very deforming condition in which you don't develop cartilage, so it affects your eyes and your joints. She has sort of effectively terrible arthritis. She has many challenges besides just being little. And when she was 9, her mother developed breast cancer. And Kiki said, what's going to happen? And her mother said, well, I have to shave my head because I'm going to have chemotherapy. And Kiki said, well, I'll help you shave it. So Chrissy, the mother, said, okay. And Kiki helped her mother shave her head. And then she said, and now I'm going to shave my head. And her mother said, what are you talking about? Of course you're not. Why would you do that? And she said, I've spent a lot of time being different by myself, and I know how hard it is, and I'd like you to have someone to be different the same way as you are at the same time. This was someone who had achieved an emotional maturity and a generosity of spirit, not in spite of the challenge that she faced, but in some way because of it. It had taught her these extraordinary lessons and given her that remarkable sensibility. I'm going to quote to you from one other magazine from the 1960s. This is the Atlantic Monthly in 1968. There is no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome child away, whether it is put away in the sense of hidden in a sanitarium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person. Whenever I recite that, people gasp, and people gasp because it seems an incredibly cruel position to have taken. There's been a lot of ink given to the change in our treatment of gay people over the last 20 years. It's in the headlines almost daily. But there's been much less coverage of our gradually shifting relationship to the idea of difference itself, much less emphasis placed on the ways in which we have become to embrace and accept a more diverse idea of what humanity is. Today, no mainstream publication could ever say a Downs is not a person. And that shift in attitude has both occasioned and been occasioned by changing realities for the lives of people with that condition. People with Down syndrome now live twice as long as they did when that article was published. Some of them are writers, some of them are actors, some of them are living semi-independently, some of them are serving on presidential commissions on disability. It's an extraordinary change. One woman who's worked with people with disabilities for many years said to me that she had gone out to lunch with the actor with Down syndrome who appears on Glee. And she said people were coming up and asking for his autograph. And she said in a tone of real wonderment, he was a celebrity first and a person with a disability second. I never thought I'd live to see that day. One of the families I got to know well as I worked on the subject of Down syndrome were Tom and Karen Robards. They were hard-charging Wall Street types when their son was born with Down syndrome. They were very taken aback. In the first few years of his life, they felt that the educational possibilities available to them weren't so great. They banded together with a few other parents and decided to start a tiny center for their children so that their children could be educated there. And they set up what has since grown into an extraordinary center, the Cook Center, which has educated untold thousands of people with disabilities. The first year, the classrooms they had were 2 unused public lavatories loaned to them by the Archdiocese of New York. So it was quite a distance they traveled. And they talked about the work they'd done, and they talked about their son, and they talked about all of it, and I said, but how do you feel about it now? This has been such a big part of your life. Do you wish it hadn't been? Do you wish your son didn't have Down syndrome? Would you like to make it go away? Do you wish you'd never heard of it? And his father said, you know, for our son David, I wish that I could make it go away, because for David it's a difficult way to be in the world, and I would like to give David an easier life. But I think if all the people with Down syndrome disappeared from the world, it would be a real loss, so the personal wish and the social wish are in opposition. And Karen Robards said, well, I'm with Tom. If we could make it go away for David, I would, because I would like David to have an easier life. But speaking for myself, while I would never have believed 23 years ago when he was born that I could say this, speaking for myself has given me so much more purposeful a life. It's made me think so much more deeply. It's given me so much more richness in all of my human relationships that speaking for myself, I wouldn't give it up for anything in the world. We live in a time of enormous social progress. We live in a time when there is acceptance of all of these kinds of difference. Deaf culture, dwarf culture, people with Down syndrome. It's all at a level it's never been at before. But at the same time that we have that social progress, we have medical progress. And the medical progress comes in the form of cochlear implants, a device which is surgically implanted in the brain, connected to a transmitter, and allows people to receive sound information straight into the brain, bypassing the structures of the ear. We live in the era of BMN 111, a compound that was recently developed by a laboratory in California. It blocks the action of the achondroplasia gene, the most common dwarfing gene. In mice with achondroplasia who are given the drug, they grow to full size. It's just begun testing in human beings. And of course, there have been recent announcements about the advances made in blood tests that will pick up Down syndrome as well as other genetic abnormalities, making it easier and easier for people to terminate such pregnancies earlier and earlier. And I'm a great believer in the medical progress, and I'm a great believer in the social progress. The applications of the medical progress are sometimes distressing, but the medical progress itself is, I think, a good. But I sometimes feel when I see them butting up against each other that they should be more awake to each other, that the medical should understand the social issues, and that the social people should recognize what's coming from the medicine, because often it feels like they're in competition. If somebody can establish a strong enough cultural identity before the cure really kicks in, then perhaps their society will be left standing. And for those for whom the identity model is less fully formed and the illness model is more prevalent, these cures will cause their conditions to disappear from the world. And that loss of diversity is frightening to me. Sometimes when I see the social progress and the medical progress coming up against each other, I think it's like those moments at the end of grand operas when the hero realizes he loves the heroine at the exact moment that she lies expiring on the sofa. I had one deaf fellow who I talked to about all of this. He said, his name is Jacob Schamberg, and his parents had done an extraordinary job of changing their lives and basically setting up a signing household in order that he would not grow up feeling left out. He had his issues nonetheless, but he said, while I'm pretty comfortable with my disability and don't see the cochlear implant as an evil force intent on destroying the deaf culture, I do get a sense of impending extinction. There will always be deaf people worldwide, but there is a real possibility that it'll be near eradicated in the developed world within the next 50 to 100 years. I say near because there will always be immigrants, untreatable conditions, cultural holdouts, and so on. But no more people like me. And I thought there was such loneliness in that phrase, no more people like me. It's a lonely phrase for anyone to contemplate. And I thought, what would it be like to think no more people like me? And I, of course, thought, what if they came up with a non-intrusive early intervention for gayness, and there were then effectively to be no more gay people in the world? What would such a world feel like? Jim Sinclair, who is an autism activist, has taken a very strong position on the issue of cure. He's part of the neurodiversity movement, or the autism rights movement, which is strongly opposed to curing autism. I frankly think that's like being strongly opposed to intergalactic travel, because the time between now and when we'll have anything that looks like a cure for autism is a long way. And it's difficult with autism to reconcile the position of autism activists who are sufficiently high-functioning to be able to express themselves in language that's comprehensible to us. How do you connect that to the experience of a child with no language who's banging his head against the wall in a corner? Nonetheless, the words of autism activists ring, I think, very true. And Sinclair said, when people say, "I wish my child did not have autism," what they're really saying is, "I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child instead." Read that again. This is what we hear when you mourn over our existence. This is what we know when you pray for a cure. That your fondest wish is that someday we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces. Now, that's a very strong way of stating it, but it is in keeping with what many of the autism activists and many of the other activists I met had to say, that they had come to self-realization as themselves, and that they didn't wish to be turned into someone else. One mother who had a daughter with autism, who had spoken 3 times in her life, described to me how terrifying that was. She said, if she'd never said anything, we might assume that there was no intelligence there and no understanding of language. But once when she was 6, I turned off the television and she suddenly said, "I want the television on." It was the first thing she'd ever said, and we waited for our world to change. And she said nothing until she was 11, when she was at school and they were doing a school play, and someone said, "What color is the king's robe?" And she said, "It's purple." And I don't know what the logjam is. I don't know why she could say things those 3 times. I don't know why she can't say things at other times. I don't know what's going on there. And she said, finally I realized, Cece is the Zen lesson. Why does Cece have autism? Because Cece has autism. And what is it like being Cece? Being Cece. Because no one else is, and will never know what it's like. It is what it is. It's not anything else. And maybe you'll never change it. And maybe you should stop trying. Schizophrenia is in some ways profoundly different from these other conditions because it sets in later in life. So if you're imagining an autistic person without autism, you're effectively imagining someone who has never existed. And if you imagine someone with schizophrenia without schizophrenia, you're probably imagining that person as they existed for the first 15 or 20 years of their life, because it's a late onset condition, even though there's now a theory that there are early signs of it that can sometimes be detected, even in childhood. Susan Weinreich is the woman with schizophrenia whom you saw in the film, and she and I had long conversations about what it was like for her to emerge from 20 years of acute psychosis and what it felt like as she began to come out of it. And she said to me, "I remember the first time I felt love after all that. I don't even remember who it was, probably my therapist. I don't remember it being ecstatic. I just remember it being like when I would go fishing as a little girl and a sunfish would catch the hook. Just that tug on the other end of the line. After all those years of being so isolated within myself and so disconnected, the psychosis began to recede, and as it receded, it left room for my heart to grow." Susan went on to talk about her schizophrenia, not only with me, but in other public contexts as well, and spoke at a big mental health dinner that took place in New York. And her mother said to me, "I couldn't believe it. There were like 300 people there, and this is Susan. I mean, how did this happen? She's definitely a stronger person than I've ever been." What saved her? It was her art. It was her doctor. It was the support from her brothers and me. But most of all, it was Susan. There was something in Susan that always wanted to come to the surface. I feel really bad that she had to go through what she went through, but I also recognize that if she hadn't, she wouldn't be who she is today. And who she is today is the most wonderful, charming, beautiful woman. Now, I was struck by these stories over and over again, which are essentially stories of resilience, stories of families who have risen to the occasion, stories of this great adoration. And I think it's important to stress, in the first place, that that's not how everybody responds. There's one story in the book of a mother who actually decided to give her severely disabled child up to social services. There's one story of a mother with a child with autism who said, I have these children, I love them, I do everything for them, and if I had it to do over again, I wouldn't have kids. And I think anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. So that perspective is in the book too. But I was haunted by how often people had engaged in these extraordinary ways with these children. And I came back time and again to the old chestnut that we not only care for our children because we love them, but also love them because we care for them. That the process of taking care of someone helpless is a very bonding process, and that in doing that, one grows very close to somebody. And these are people who have required a great deal of care of one kind or another, which makes it perhaps less startling to hear these declarations of dedication from their parents. I wanted to look at the idea that what's difficult is difference rather than the social valence attached to that difference, and so I went to look at musical prodigies. I wanted to see what that was like. It's much less sad to have a child who's a musical prodigy than to have a child with multiple severe disabilities. It's less sad, but it's not easier. Parents have to figure out what on earth they're supposed to do with a child who is asynchronous, in the same way that someone who is 30 years old but has the mind of a 4-year-old has a difficult time in the world, so does someone who's 4 years old but has the mind of a 30-year-old. It's very difficult to reconcile all of that, and the person is either going to spend time with people who understand what he's talking about but don't want to make friends with a 4-year-old, or with other 4-year-olds who have absolutely no idea what anything he's talking about has anything to do with. And parents describe this as a real struggle. And I went and met a broad range of prodigies at various stages of their development. And prodigies also are fragile. Some of them go on to be the great musicians of all time, and some of them burn out. And parents were terrified that their children were going to burn out. And yet at the same time, they were ambitious for their children, and some of them felt that they wanted their children to be able fully to exploit a talent that's hard to develop if it's not developed early. So there was one young pianist I met, Chinese-American boy who was 7 when I met him, but he was very small and looked like he was about 5. He needed a phone book when he sat on the piano bench. And at the time that I met him, he was doing a concert program that had him performing somewhere else every couple of weeks. He was doing homeschooling with his mother. He had piano lessons in California where he lived, but he then had supplementary ones once a month with a teacher in Shanghai because his mother believed that the standards of teaching in Shanghai were higher for certain aspects of pianism. And I went off to meet them, and I sat in their house. He was working on an SAT book, and I said to his mother, do you ever worry about his having some kind of a normal childhood? And Mark interrupted, and he said, I have a normal childhood. Do you want to come upstairs and see my room? It's kind of messy, but you can come anyway. And I said, okay. So we went up to his room, and he showed me his favorite cartoons, and I noticed piled up next to the television a stack of Sesame Street videos of various descriptions. And then we finished, and he said, okay, now let's go downstairs, and I'll play you the Chopin Fantasy Impromptu. And I said, okay. And we went downstairs, and he sat down, and he played the Chopin Fantasy Impromptu with a level of emotional engagement and mature wisdom that was inconceivable in someone who still liked Cookie Monster. And I said to his mother when he finished, I turned and looked at her, and she said to me, you see, he's not a normal child. Why should he have a normal childhood? And she later said to me, you know, in America, every kid has to be well-rounded. They have 10 different activities, and they never excel at any of them. Americans want everyone to have the same life. It's a cult of the average. This is wonderful for disabled children who get things they would never have otherwise, but it's a disaster for gifted children. Why should Mark spend his life learning sports he's not interested in when he has this superb gift that gives him so much joy? It's not necessarily how I would do things, but I was sympathetic that it's a reasonable way to do things. The last section in that main bulk center of my book of looking at conditions is about people who are transgender. The structure of the book was really that the first 6 of those chapters deal with things that have been acknowledged as physical conditions and that are clearly called illnesses, and the second half is things that are much more socially defined. And being transgender is one of those areas in which the relationship between nature and nurture and circumstance and genetics and biology is still unbelievably confused. I interviewed Norm Spack, one of the leading endocrinologists working on this topic, and I said to him, do you think that we're getting close to being able to see what's happening? And he said, our views of the brain are like those first pictures that were taken from outer space of the Earth. You can see the continents and the weather systems and the oceans. It's spectacular. He said, when you can read the numbers on the license plates, we'll know what causes gender dysphoria. And I went and heard extraordinary topics, extraordinary tales, and tales of great triumph and tales of great despair that were tied into the experience of people who were transgender. And it was striking to me how this was a difference that somehow seemed to bring out either the best or the worst in the communities in which it occurred. I'll begin by telling you about a woman named Ann O'Hara who grew up in a small rural town in the South, settled in a small town in Tennessee, became the special needs teacher in that school, taught all of the children with special needs in that town for 20 years. In the course of that time, at one point had a child who was brought who had been so horribly abused beforehand that he didn't have any language at the age of 4. And she eventually helped him to develop language. It was a child who had a mother who had severe mental illness, but who instead of taking her antipsychotics, fed them to her children to keep them quiet. And that was what she had done. And she then Anne found out, that this child and his 2 brothers were going to be broken up because nobody was willing to take on all 3 of them as a foster parent. And she said, I'll adopt all 3 of them. And so she took these 3 traumatized, troubled children, and she worked on them through that special education process that she knew so well, and she worked with them, and she worked with them, and she got them all out of special ed and into regular ed. And one of them turned out to have pediatric bipolar disorder, and when that became clear, she helped him get treatment for it. And one of them turned out to have ADHD, and once that was really established, she helped him get treatment for that. And the third one just always seemed so sad, and she never knew why, and she never knew what to do about it. And one day she was sitting with him, and he said, Mom, life would be so much better if I were a girl. She was very taken aback. She'd never heard of anything like this. And he said, you must know that I'm really a girl. I've always been really a girl. That's who I am. Stop making me pretend to be a boy. It's too hard. Well, she did some research, and she found out a little bit about what it meant to be transgender. And she finally said to her son, his name was Kerry, she said, if you will see out the end of the school year as a boy, then I will let you try living as a girl for a week this summer, and we'll see whether it really makes any difference to you. And so Kerry finished out the year, and the week came, and she allowed him, having already taken him to a therapist in Nashville who had confirmed the diagnosis that he was in fact trans, she allowed him to live as a girl named Kelly. And she said the transformation was unimaginable. She said suddenly, from this morose, sad little boy, she got this exuberant, bouncy, funny little girl who was running around and giving everyone hugs and having a great time. She said she and her husband instantly saw there was no way that they could make their child go back to living as a boy. So she got copies of some books on what it means to be transgender and about transgender children in particular. And she went into her children's school, the school where she had taught for 20 years, and she explained that when Kerry came back in the fall, she would be a girl named Kelly instead, and this was how it worked, and she provided all this information. She said by the time she got back to her house, the telephone calls had started. There were people calling and saying that they were going to kill that child. There were people saying they were going to take that child and raise it upright. There were people saying they were going to kill her. Some of them were voices that she recognized. Some of them were voices she'd never heard before. And she said she went into a kind of paralysis. And then she described sitting at home with her children, and she said, I stayed up that night with a shotgun in front of the door. And the next day, my pediatrician called me, and he said, the conversation at the pool isn't about whether to kill your child. It's about when to do it and what to use for that purpose. So if you want that child to live, you'd better get her out of this town pretty darn quick. And so Anne packed up the family car with her 3 children and as many of her belongings as she could fit in, and she drove away, never to return to that town again. Her husband stayed behind because they needed the income from his job working in a factory, and he went to work the next day, and when he came home, the family dog had been disemboweled and nailed to a fence, the message that their child was next. And when I talked to Anne about this whole experience, she said to me, "I don't love my daughter less for mourning over this, but I miss my mom, I miss my sister. My daddy's grave is back there, and I just have to hope other people are putting flowers on it. I miss my dog, I miss my students. I feel really guilty because I'm still hung up on all this stuff that we left behind. I should just let that go. But it makes me so angry that these people have taken our lives from us. But you can't grieve all the time when you have kids. You see how far they've come and they reach you right in your heart. That moment when they come off the bus is one of my best moments every day. My other is when they come in the morning and collide on top of me in bed. So regret? No. I miss things that were in the old life. But if I knew this was going to happen, I would still adopt Kelly. I'm the lucky one. Because honestly, if it weren't for Kelly coming into my life, I would have never entered this bigger, more beautiful world where I've met you and so many other wonderful people. I mean, if you just look at it, Kelly has brought more blessings into my life than I could possibly give back to her. Now, I'm going to contrast that story with the elements of woe that are in it with the story of Kim Reed, who's the trans woman who was in the film. Kim Reed grew up in Helena, Montana, and when she was growing up in Helena, Montana, she was a boy named Paul, and she was the quarterback on her high school football team. And she first came back to Helena for her father's funeral when he died many years later. She had seen her parents, but outside of town and had never been home. And then she decided she'd made it back, and she was going to go to her 20th reunion, and she was going to make a film about going to her 20th reunion. So she came with her girlfriend. She's now a lesbian in Lower Manhattan. She came to the high school 20th reunion, and my favorite moment in the film is when she's talking to one of the people from her class who says politely, "But Kim, we've all changed." The film was a success, and the pastor from Kim's church called her and said that he would like to show the film at the church one night. And Kim said, "Well, I don't live in Helena. My mom lives in Helena, so that's really not up to me. It's up to my mom, but if she's up for it, I'm up for it." So Carol, her mom, said, "I thought it was better. It was a film about Helena. It was going to come here sooner or later. It was better to have it happen at the church where people know and love me than to have it happen in the movie theater in town where I have no control over it." But it was very hard for her. And in the end, what Kim and the pastor at her church agreed was that the film would be shown on Friday night, that there would be symposiums or seminars at the church on Saturday for people to discuss the topics it brought up, and that on Sunday, Kim would be able to preach the sermon at church. And the film played Friday to standing ovations, and the discussion groups on Saturday were attended by many people. And on Sunday, the pastor told me that he had never seen the church that full when it wasn't Christmas or New Year's Eve. And I'm going to read to you just a little excerpt from Kim's sermon that day. "The night before last, when our film was playing in here, I went outside to the columbarium where my father's ashes rest. As I was kneeling there by what I called Dad's spot, I thought of the hours and hours of videotape that he shot lovingly of me during my football games, and how much of the same footage was now being shown inside this sanctuary as part of my film. Now, it's certainly not the context that any of us expected, but I knew Dad would be proud. And just then, the dusk breeze blew in this waft of sound, and it was strangely familiar to me, and I realized it was the crosstown football game coming from the stadium. The band was playing, and the announcer was bellowing, and all of these old tapes were playing inside here on the screen, and I knew that new ones were being recorded just a few blocks away. Those recording their new memories to tape should be only so lucky as to be surprised by the last thing that they expected from their loved ones, only so fortunate as to get a chance to welcome them home with radical love. I thought about how all these cycles of lives would continue on, and so many aspects of my life coalesced in that one moment, that one beautiful, stunning, blessed moment. The past and the present, parent and child, male and female, the pain that life sometimes brings, and the soothing love that welcomes it with open arms after its exhausting journey into a distant country. And when Kim's mother was asked in the context of one of these conversations, someone had argued that this was perhaps against the will of God to be transgender, and someone said to her, "Do you believe in God?" And she said, "I believe in my child, and I believe in God." It was a very moving conversation. Of the many people I met who had gone through the process of having to love children who presented challenges to love, the most dramatic story, without question, was the story of Tom and Sue Klebold, the parents of Dylan Klebold, who was the perpetrator, or one of the perpetrators, of the Columbine massacre. I had spent years persuading them to talk to me, which they initially didn't want to do. They finally agreed to do it. They were very hesitant. I got out there, and they were so full of their story that once we began, they couldn't stop telling it. And they talked about it and talked about it, and the first weekend we spent together, I recorded 30 hours of interviews. And on Sunday, we were sitting in the kitchen, and Sue was making dinner, and we were all totally exhausted from this whole conversation. And I said, "Well, if Dylan were here now, is there anything you'd want to ask him?" And Tom said, "There sure is. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing." And Sue Klebold looked at the floor, and she thought for a minute. And then she looked back up and said, "I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head." And a few years later, I had dinner with Sue in Denver. I'd seen them often in between. On this particular occasion, she said, "You know, when it first happened, I used to wish I had never married, had never had children. If I hadn't gone to Ohio State, I wouldn't have crossed paths with Tom. This person wouldn't have existed, and this thing wouldn't have happened. But over time, I've come to feel that I loved the children I had so much that I wouldn't want to imagine a life without them, even at the cost of this pain." When I say that, I'm talking about my own pain, of course, not the pain of other people. But life is full of suffering, and this is mine. So while I recognize that it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, I've decided that it would not have been better for me. I was amazed by many of these assertions. How could it be that the Klebolds didn't wish that they'd never had this child? How could it be that the parents of the dwarfs and the people with schizophrenia and the people with deafness didn't at some level feel as though they'd had a bad turn from fate? The more I thought about it, the more I thought that all of us who have children, most of us who have children who are flawed and love them with those flaws, and that the process of being a parent is one of embracing a flawed being. And if some glorious angel broke through my living room ceiling and offered to take away the children I have and exchange them for other, better children who were, nicer and smarter and more polite, I would pray away that atrocious spectacle. It would be a terrifying thing to me. And I think all of us feel that. We love the people we love, complete with their flaws and differences. And it's not so surprising that all of these parents were so attached to all of these children. And in the end, I thought that this whole business is actually borne out in the life of all families, because all families have children who are different. I have yet to meet anyone who has not occasionally looked at his or her child and said, "What planet did you come from?" And in looking at these more extreme kinds of difference, I think we illuminate the reality of all parenting, which is of reckoning with difference. I'm always particularly moved by two things that were said to me, both by mothers of multiple children with multiple disabilities. One was someone who had two sons with disabilities. One of them died tragically through caregiver neglect. And when his ashes were interred, she said, "Let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed. Once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved." And another one of the mothers, who also had two children with disabilities, said to me, "People always regale us with these little sayings, like God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen. And that idea that it's a choice seems to me to be an extraordinarily important one. I started off thinking some of these families find meaning and some of them don't find it. And I thought of meaning as being this thing that was sitting there and you could find it or you couldn't find it. It was sort of hidden, but if you really looked, you could find it. And I came to think what it's really about is creating meaning. It's really about creating a structure within which you can end up grateful for a life you would have done anything to avoid. And I thought that the experiences of all these families had so much in common. So while I'd like to think I had some insights into the particular conditions, the primary insight of the book is that all this dealing with difference is very much the same. If you think you have something in common only with other parents of deaf people, or other parents of criminals, or other parents of people who are transgender, you're narrowing yourself into a fairly small silo. But if you think that you have something in common with everyone who's dealing with a child who has a bewildering and in some sense overwhelming difference, then you discover that you're not in small company, you're actually in the embrace of much of the world. When I started off this book, I still thought that mainstreaming, the practice of having disabled children in school with non-disabled children, was a great idea for the disabled children, but kind of a nuisance for the non-disabled children who would get slowed down. And now I hope my children will be in schools in which there is inclusion, because the lessons in humanity that they teach are worth to me such a great deal more than his getting through long division a week earlier or a week later. Thank you. So I decided while I was working on this book to have children, and people kept saying to me, how can you be having children right in the middle of a book about everything that can go wrong? And I said, but it's not really a book about everything that can go wrong. It's a book about how much love and joy there can be in parenting even when everything goes wrong. And all my insecurities about whether I could love my own children in the way that I needed to were somehow laid to rest. I thought if all of these people could love all of these children under all of these circumstances, I'm going to be just fine at loving my own children. So I will describe briefly the modern structure of my family, which is that my husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. One of my closest friends from college asked me to be the father of her child after she had gone through a divorce, and so she and I have a daughter who lives in Texas. Mother and daughter live in Texas. And then John and I decided that we'd like to have a child in our house with us full time, and so we have a son of whom I am the biological father. We had an egg donor, and our surrogate was Laura, the lesbian mother of his 2 biological children. So the shorthand is 5 parents of 4 children in 3 states. And there seem to be people who think that the existence of families such as mine somehow weakens or undermines the existence of families such as theirs. And I don't accept those subtractive models of love, only additive ones. And I think in the same way that we need to have species diversity to keep the planet going, we need to have this diversity not only of human experience represented by the disabilities and differences I described, but also in the structure of family and affection if we want to strengthen the ecosphere of kindness. Now, the day after our son was born, the pediatrician came into the hospital room and said that she was concerned. She said he wasn't extending his legs correctly. And I said, oh. And she said, that could indicate neurological or brain damage. And insofar as he was extending them, he was doing so asymmetrically, which could indicate a possible tumor in the brain, and that he also had a very large head and should be tested for hydrocephalus. And so we went with this child who was less than 24 hours old to the MRI room, to the CAT scanner, to have other x-rays done, to have measurements taken, to have an arterial blood draw. And I felt the whole middle pouring out of my being, and I thought, here I spent all of this time writing a book about parents dealing with children who are disabled and how much meaning can be found in it, and I so profoundly didn't want to join their number. But I realized as I did so that I was thinking of whatever would be wrong with George as an illness, and it was an illness, and like all parents, I wanted to protect my child from illness. But I knew that if he had one of those conditions, it would become his identity. And if it became his identity, it would become my identity too, and it wouldn't always feel this way. And I thought to myself as I looked at him there, the love you have for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. I heard that voice of my mother's. At the end of 6 hours, the pediatrician called us in and said that all the scans were clear and that he now was extending his legs correctly. And when I asked what she thought had been wrong in the morning, she said he had probably had a cramp. Children, I think, had ensnared me as soon as I connected fatherhood with loss, but I doubt I would have noticed that if I hadn't been in the thick of the research for this particular book. In the interviews I'd done with these many, many families, I had encountered so much strange love, and that made it easy to fall into its bewitching patterns. I had witnessed and learned the terrifying joy of unbearable responsibility and seen how it conquers everything else. And sometimes I had thought the parents I was writing about were fools, enslaving themselves to a lifetime's journey with their miserable children, trying to breed identity out of sickness. And that day with George in the hospital, I realized that my research had built me a plank and that I was ready to join them on their ship. Thank you.